But let's just jump right in. What, Roger, to your mind, is the problem with moral relativism?
Well, there is an intellectual problem as to what it is. What does a moral relativist believe? He obviously believes that moral judgments do not have any kind of absolute force, but what follows from that? Are they relative to something? If so, to what are they relative? That's one problem. And there's a huge discussion in the literature about this, very inconclusive discussion. But the real problem is what it means to ordinary people who don't have the philosophical training and the philosophical inclinations that some of us have, who nevertheless hear this expression, moral relativism. They hear phrases like, it's all relative, or that there are no absolute values, or that any judgment that you make is your judgment from your point of view, there's no objective point of view, and so on. These are all garbled versions of philosophical positions, but they are very influential on ordinary people, and have given rise to the feeling that really, in the end, there is no point outside the individual's own perspective from which he can be judged. He can only be judged from within his own perspective, in terms of his own desires, ambitions, aims, and so on. And which means that judgment becomes a kind of impertinence. And as a result, of course, people cease to share any conception that they are joined in a common enterprise.
Right. Maybe in just a few sentences, what exactly is moral relativism, and maybe you can put it in sort of layman's terms, and what's been its unique contribution to Western thought?
Well, I would say that in layman's terms, a moral relativist is somebody who believes that a moral judgment is the expression of the subjective opinion of a particular person, and that it cannot be evaluated from any other position than his own. Mm-hmm. So every judgment is relative to the interests and position of the person who makes it. So that in the end, there is no position outside the individual from which he can be judged.
Right. So then maybe an older view of thinking or philosophy or of approaching life would have been an endeavor to discover truth, or something like that.
Yeah, obviously one contrast with this is the religious worldview, which says that there is a position outside the individual's interests from which he is judged. That is the position occupied by God, who, as it were, provides that overview, systematic overview of all our desires and all our aims, and is in a position to judge us. We can then, by, as it were, discovering what his position is, come to an objective view of our own situation. Right. And obviously, the obvious thing to say about moral relativism is that it's what is left when the religious worldview collapses. And that's perhaps one reason why it is so prevalent now.
Right. Do you have to have, though, a religious worldview? Would an Aristotle have viewed it that way? Do you necessarily need to be religious to recognize that truth might exist and it would be worthwhile to discover what that is?
No, you don't. And of course, that has been one of the efforts of philosophy down the centuries. Aristotle is only one example. Kant is another. The effort to produce a fulcrum on which our worldview can turn, which is not simply our individual desires. And I think for a long time after the Enlightenment, Western intellectuals believed that they had discovered that in the idea of morality put forward by Kant, or perhaps some version that was downstream from that, like the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill and so on, which gave a secular grounding to a shared moral position, which would not be the position of any particular person, but the position of all of us. And from that we could come to conclusions about what was right and wrong, which didn't privilege the individual and his desires. But of course, I think there's been an increasing, during the 20th century, an increasing despair that that project was possible.
Right.
This despair had many forms, but one of the most important from the point of view of rhetoric was the existentialist position of people like Sartre. Sartre said, he argued that there is no position from which I can be judged except my own. So that the only thing that can authenticate my moral judgments is my choice that those are my judgments.
Right.
So the difference between a moral and an immoral person, on Sartre's view, is simply that the moral person is somebody who wills his own desires as commitments, whereas the immoral person is someone who just has those desires. So on that view, the authentic existentialist rapist is the one who you should praise, not the person who simply is tempted by his sexual appetites.
Right. So there's this subjective understanding of truth where I can't necessarily judge your value system or whatever else. We're told that this has led to an age of toleration, and yet a lot of those folks who espouse, I think, maybe a postmodern moral relativist view, use the words ought and should and must quite a bit. So how do we arrive at that, sort of a didactic moral relativism?
It's a very good question. That it is obviously a part of human nature to affirm ourselves through moral judgments. And when people adopt the view that all moral judgments are relative or subjective, they turn that into an objective morality too. So it becomes a kind of sin to be other than a relativist. You know, and you see this happening especially in things like the European Court of Human Rights, where when you find people with old-fashioned objective systems of values constantly being called before the judges and reproached for the fact that they are discriminating against people who don't share their values. Right? So it becomes ever more difficult to retain those old-fashioned objective views of what morality is without being condemned on moral grounds for having those views. So that subjective, a kind of subjectivism becomes a moral norm. So it's not that people have really given up on the idea of objective morality, it's that they're making a certain kind of subjectivity into an objective morality. It's a kind of paradox, and you see this paradox already in Nietzsche, and people like that who Nietzsche affirmed this, something like a subjectivist view of morality, that what matters, he says, is to will your own desire as a law. You know, it's your own desire and the will to power that is expressed through it. That's the essence of the moral position. But of course, Nietzsche very quickly turned that from a doctrine of liberation into a doctrine of condemnation. Condemnation of all the people who couldn't live in that way and needed the support of an objective framework. Right. And I think you're finding that happening now in the kind of moralism that surrounds the European enterprise. I suspect that this becomes obscure because very often modern moralism clothes itself in the concept of a human right. You know, the idea of universal human rights is a sort of political expression of the 18th century Enlightenment morality, especially it grows out of Locke and out of Kant, and it is what we have retained in the modern world of that noble effort to construct an objective morality without God. You know, and this morality had the form of a respect for universal human rights that we all possess by virtue of our human nature, and which we can affirm against each other, we can lay claim to them, and expect others to acknowledge that claim. Yeah, so it gives a fulcrum outside the individual desire on which the issue can be turned. But it all went terribly wrong, in my view, after the Second World War, when people lost any sight of what the list of human rights consisted of. Originally, in people like Locke and also in Kant, human rights are fundamentally negative things. You know, a right not to be interfered with, not to have your life taken away, not to have your freedom taken away, not to have your property taken away, and so on.
And these would have been ideas that the American founding would have been rooted in.
Essentially liberal ideas.
Right.
And it's a sort of axiom of that way of thinking that your right is my duty. So if you have a right, I have a duty towards you to respect it. If your right is simply not to be interfered with, it's easy for me to fulfill that duty. I don't interfere with you, I don't kill you, take your property, enslave you, and so on. But with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, all kinds of new rights came into existence, or they didn't come into existence, they were postulated by the process that then was initiated, including the right to have a job, the right to have security of home life, the right to have sufficient to cover the basic needs of existence, the right to health care, and so on. And gradually this list of rights expanded. These are not freedoms, but claims. They're very different. It's not a freedom to go about your business undisturbed, but a claim that people are given against each other.
And that claim is rooted in what? A communal desire for...
Well, at the time, it was part of the whole move towards a more socialist conception of the state. Right. Because once you make these claims, if you hold on to the axiom that my right is somebody else's duty, you automatically have to answer the question, well, whose is the duty to provide? Right. And of course, it's not the duty of any particular person, it becomes the duty of society, which is another name for the state. Right. And so it led to a massive expansion of the state's embeddedness in human relations. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing is, of course, part of the disputes in politics to this day. And it's one of the things which separated liberals from socialists. But irrespective of whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, it clearly involves a radical change in our conception of what a right is. A right becomes a claim that we can each make against each other. Right. Of course, then this tends to undermine people's sense that there really is any objective authority to the idea of a right. When somebody comes along and says to me that he has a certain claim against me, even though there is no relationship, I tend to think of that as nonsense. And so this confusion about the idea of human rights means that there's a considerable amount of nonsense embedded in our legal systems.
Right. In a political order sort of founded on this idea, where rights are sort of dictated or coming from the state, if you feel like you're a victim of nonsense, what can you appeal to?
It's a very good question. And people, let me give you an interesting case. In my country, we have a very important tradition of planning law, which arose from between the wars, but was solidified after the Second World War, according to which you cannot build houses in the countryside, not without very special permission, because people valued the countryside. We're, as you know, an overcrowded little island, and wanted to preserve it. And this law creates certain duties on the part of the citizen, obviously to obey it, not to build just anywhere, anyhow. And people accepted it as a piece of legislation. It doesn't talk about anybody's rights. It just talks about what duties are under the law. But then Irish travellers enjoying freedom of movement under the European Union laws come and settle in our countryside with their caravans, scraping away the topsoil, putting down concrete, and littering the place with these, what to you Americans would call trailer parks.
Right.
And then, of course, this is against the law. But they appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, saying that we have a right, as an ethnic minority, to live in our traditional way. And this is our traditional way. Now, if the court upholds that judgment and says that they do have a right, then all other interests are cancelled by it, because a right is a non-negotiable privilege.
Right.
Whereas the neighbours of these people just have whatever ordinary legislative rights and duties have been laid down. So, the result is that this law is no longer applicable. Now, this isn't me, is it? No. One thing that happens as a result of that, of course, is that is social tension.
Right.
Indeed, we've already had a couple of murders in one of these camps as a result of this. You know, most people don't accept the fact that they, having obeyed the law to maintain the beautiful environment in which they were, can see it just taken away from them by people who don't have to obey the law because they can overreach it through these international courts. But increasingly that is happening, that overreaching of the law through the doctrine of human rights and through these claims that people make, claims to lifestyle and so on.
So you're suggesting that there really is nothing to appeal once you reach a certain state?
Well, this is a technical problem, but in our law, and I think in all laws, if something is a right attaching to an individual, then that's it.
Right.
The judge is obliged to grant it. Okay. There can be conflicts of rights, but you see, the neighbours of the travellers, in the case I'm considering, didn't have any rights in the matter. They just had interests. So the court had no way of judging in their favour.
Sure. But often laws are made with interest in mind.
Oh yes, and that's the whole purpose of legislation, that it tries to take all the interests into consideration and find an acceptable compromise solution.
Right.
And that's only one example that I took, but there are plenty that are much more relevant perhaps to life in this part of the world, although I suspect the European Court of Human Rights will certainly upset relations between Hungarians and Roma in this country by overriding settled ways of dealing, and you might have the same sort of problem. But more important are things like the conflict that arises between the Catholic worldview and this new concept of human rights. Catholics have always said, we were the true originators of the human right idea. Look at St. Thomas, it's all there, the concept of natural law. And we uphold human rights, and we believe indeed that there is this universal jurisdiction which is God's. But these rights are not for us to determine according to political criteria or according to the desires of people in secular society. They are eternal. So, you know, for instance, although there is a right to life, the Roman Catholic will say that right attaches to the unborn too, you know, to the child in the womb. And the European Court of Human Rights will say no, because that interferes with the right to abortion that we guarantee, because it's part of what is offered by way of settling disputes in a secular society. Right. So the Polish government has had to confront this, and I'm not sure that it's resolved it yet as to whether it can change, whether it's going to change its law on abortion or not.
Right. So you seem to be suggesting that you know, the phrase "different strokes for different folks" sounds all well and good, but in fact, when you have such maybe radically different ideas about justice and life and truth, and you have to build a society or live and make laws, have neighbors, that it actually can be an impediment and may actually not lead to toleration?
Well, yeah, we got off the topic of toleration. The influence of moral relativism is to say that, you know, it's intolerant to make judgments at all. Right. You know, this is what we find often said in my country, that someone being judgmental is committing the primary moral fault. You know, and real toleration means not discriminating at all against against rival views, accepting all views as equally valid. But actually, toleration means the opposite of that. Toleration means accepting what you don't approve of, accepting what you do disagree with. And our tradition in England of toleration, which grew up in the 17th century, was a solution to radical conflict. It was people learnt to be tolerant precisely of the things that they really hated. Learning not to hate them means not tolerating at all, because there's nothing to tolerate. And this is a very important virtue in this case, toleration, but it depends upon having objective moral values.
Right. So in that sense, toleration, the way we might understand it today, is actually quite a bit different than maybe the Christian concept of brotherly love or the golden rule.
Yes, and I mean, the Christian concept of brotherly love means loving the sinner and hating the sin. Right. And I mean, that's a very different conception from the modern version, which is more like loving the sin and not regarding it as one.
Right. Well, before we turn to questions from the audience, let's discover what the absence of truth claims or making judgments, what that means in other areas of life. So you've written that in art and architecture, whereas maybe in art the original idea was to try to point the viewer of that sculpture or that painting towards some sort of higher plane and toward a closer realization of some sort of truth. And in architecture, of course, the main idea was to create structures that were to be inhabitable for humans to live or to work in. Has that changed?
No. It's much more difficult to defend some kind of objective aesthetics than it is to defend an objective morality. In the end, once you've stated the questions of morality clearly, an awful lot of it is plain common sense, as the name of your society commemorates. But plain common sense about art is quite difficult to obtain. In fact, it seems to me architecture is the only clear example in which people do spontaneously agree with each other. Everybody, that is to say, except architects. And that's because architects make money out of it. And I think you will find that certainly in the European context, there is a natural tendency to accept certain forms and to reject others, except forms which give the air of a settlement.
Right.
A place where you can be at home. And that, because architecture is touching on something which is deeper than aesthetics, which is our need to settle together as communities. And from that need follow things like the shapes of windows, the shapes of roofs, the heights of buildings,
Right.
and even things like details, you know, shadows. You can't live in a building, you can't look at a building which doesn't have shadows.
Right.
There's one over there which has none. Which is kind of glazed monstrosity, like a big eye looking at the people of Budapest and defying them. You know, it's not something in the shadow, in the vicinity of which you can actually feel at home. That's part of its purpose, because it's there to sell things, not to soothe people. But I think in the sphere of architecture you can draw on other things than the pure look of buildings in order to establish some kind of consensus, and it's very clear from the cities of Europe that that consensus has existed for at least 3,000 years, in a very broad sense.
Right.
You know, the column and the architrave and the roof and the window, you know, these are standard things. When it comes to music and painting, things look a little bit different, but still, you know, that there's an expectation in most morally alive people that art should not, as D.H. Lawrence puts it, do dirt on life. It shouldn't desecrate the ordinary expectations and the ordinary modes of fulfillment that people have. And, you know, obscenity, destructive violence, chaos, works about that seem to celebrate the negative. For that reason, I think, put people's teeth on edge and also give them a sense a sense of sacrilege sometimes. And working out that idea is one thing to which I've devoted, you know, some of my work. So I have a few things to say about it.
All right. Let's open it up for questions.
I think, yes, that these international human rights organizations are... Part of the problem with them is that, as you imply, that the agenda has grown uncontrolled. So we don't really know whether there is a human right to social welfare. You know, is there a human right to a roof over your head, or a human right to health? What would settle the question? Nobody knows. So, you know, I can obviously claim that I have a human right as a red-haired person to special privileges when travelling in places like this where there are so few of them. You know, and people do, but most people would laugh at it and say, no, that's ridiculous. But nevertheless, what are the grounds? Nobody knows. And so that is part of the problem. There's an attempt to produce a kind of universal objective morality, but without any conception of where it comes from. The idea that people can't be judges in their own cause, of course, is universally accepted, only because everybody has an interest in their own cause other than its justice. You know, the fundamental idea of natural justice, at least in English law, is that a dispute between two people must be adjudicated by a third person who has no interest in either side. If you have no interest in the matter, only justice can motivate your decision. That's the idea. It is problematic. They have political agendas and all that, of course, and they get taken over by people who have a decided desire to reform whole societies. I mean, the European Union, the European Commission is very much characterized by this, because it is staffed by people who belong to essentially the transnational rootless elite, who don't actually have very many beliefs of a traditional kind, and are extremely irritated by the spectacle of a place like Poland and a place like Hungary. I mean, there's lots to be irritated about Hungary, no doubt. But you know, the European Commission is the first to be irritated, and will have reference to these vaguely defined human rights in order to make its position known, and that of course can produce enormous resentment. I mean, it has produced resentment in certainly in my country and in Poland, and it will go on doing so.
Okay, let me ask another question. You're talking about the EU. So in the European Parliament, I think not long ago there was some sort of a decision made that you couldn't use gender distinctive terms in the document. So no monsieur, no madame, no Fräulein, whatever else. Is this, of course we know there are now folks who think of sort of different layers of gender. So you can be male-bodied or female-bodied, which is an anatomical thing, as opposed to your identity, which would then be male or female. So does this idea also originate in that gender is not something you can observe with a rational mind and sort of know what it is, but it really is about your identity, your judgment of yourself?
Well, yes. This is another issue. It's very easy for these transnational institutions like the European Parliament to respond to pressure groups of small organized people. You know, obviously radical feminists from France in this particular case. And those people probably wouldn't be able to force their views upon the whole public of France through the normal democratic process, because then they would come up against the fact that the French people don't want to lose monsieur, madame, mademoiselle, and so on. Right. This is one way in which elites impose their views on majorities by using these roundabout transnational institutions. Although in America the elites use the Supreme Court in the same way to bypass ordinary people's feelings. This has been obvious in the case of abortion, that the standard New York liberal position on abortion was made into a nationwide orthodoxy through the Supreme Court. Okay, it's moving back the other way, but that's something that just does happen. Many people say, well, it doesn't matter. You know, what does it matter whether we drop the word monsieur, mademoiselle, or whatever? But it's a bit like what happened in Turkey in 1922, I think, when Ataturk said the Turkish language must no longer be written in Arabic script. It's got to be written in the Latin alphabet. That's much more sensible and straightforward, and then it'd be much easier to people to learn it from the Western countries, and we could relate to Western countries much more easily. And it had a fantastic effect. It changed Turkish society in a radical way, but it cut Turks off completely from their literary past. You know, nobody in Turkey today can read any of the classics, except a few, you know, for highly educated people. Maybe that doesn't matter because the classics weren't any good, but I don't think that is true.
Right.
But in a similar way, but not less severely, American feminism, which is insisting on the feminine pronoun, is cutting off many people from the natural sense of the rhythm of English as used by those you know, reactionary writers like Hume and Burke and even John Stuart Mill. That's a very good point. I think, I don't think I've succeeded in defining moral relativism because I think it's so elusive a thing. One might say that a certain kind of conservatism which says that custom has a validity of its own, which is what you're saying, is very appealing. But it isn't a form of relativism because it is actually validating custom as such. It's saying, you know, custom does have a value, and that's the way we look for the solutions. And these solutions have emerged from people's interaction over generations, and that's why we should respect them. This is something that Burke said in his reflections on the French Revolution, and really he was speaking about a very objective moral truth. You know, that the answers to social questions are not invented, but discovered, and they're discovered over time through the people's interaction.
But of course, different people perhaps don't discover them, and maybe have bad customs.
Yeah.
So when for example, and noticing these differences among peoples is, I guess, as old as history, because Herodotus famously noted differences in some of the African tribes and in Eurasia. So how do you then treat different customs if you recognize them to be somewhat morally
This is what the Enlightenment wanted to do, was to, as I said, to find that position outside specific customs from which they could all be judged, and the universal doctrine of human rights was supposed to be that position. And my view is that perhaps it is, as long as the rights are treated in this purely negative way that the American founders treated them, and as Kant treated them, and really as Aquinas treated them. But when the doctrine of human rights starts escalating without any grounds, then all you're doing is imposing a new elite morality on people who can't possibly accept it. But there are problems. As we know, most of us feel that there are aspects of many of the Muslim societies that we are becoming familiar with these days, which we can't accept. You know, forced marriage, honor killing, even perhaps the constant concealing of women. You know, to us that is repugnant. But you know, there is a question in many people's minds: if you then just impose the Enlightenment liberal morality on these communities, are you doing them a service or not? Right. You know, there is a real conflict here, a conflict of values.
But of course, some of our customs they probably also think are repugnant.
Yes.
So then, what are we to do?
Well, the answer was that you know, to send them back home, but you can't say that. You have to say, no, we've got to live together as communities, and they are right to be repelled by, you know, pornography and all the things that they're repelled by in our communities, and we're right to be repelled by their treatment of women, right. And an accommodation over time might improve both of us.
Right. And on the same topic, in England, is the acceptance of certain forms of Sharia law within the British legal system, is that sort of a natural outgrowth of our wanting to treat their understanding of justice as similar or as equal to ours and as somehow compatible, even in the same nation?
No, because our nation is founded upon the rule of law, and this law has always been secular, and what the law is settled by Parliament and by the courts in obedience to Parliament. To say that there should be a Sharia law adjudicated in parallel is effectively to deny that there is a unified nation. The Ottoman Empire lasted in this way for a long time, saying that that family affairs are adjudicated by Sharia if the family is Sunni Muslim, or by the canon law of the Catholic Church if they're Maronite, and so on, and the Orthodox jurisdiction of Constantinople for Athens, I think, yes, for the Greek Catholic, and so on, and they managed it, but they managed it only because there were no nations. It was an empire without borders. We have the view that the ultimate source of authority is the nation state defined by its borders. And within those borders, the law, the secular law as determined by Parliament, is the final authority. That's not just an arbitrary thing for us, that is the foundation of our obedience. And if a community grows up within those borders not accepting that, then it doesn't belong within those borders. And there's no other solution.
So by endorsing parallel legal systems, then they are in fact rejecting
the nation state.
That's
yeah.
Exactly right. Okay.
It doesn't follow from the fact that our obedience is to the rule of law that the law can just be anything. There are internal constraints, not only the constraints of democratic election to Parliament, but the constraints of constitutions and of procedures embedded within the law. And the problem with Carl Schmitt, one of the many problems with Carl Schmitt, was that he had, yes, but he had this kind of extremism of the time, of those terrible years between the wars, where he just wanted to put a guillotine through everything and said, at a certain stage it stops, and he says he is leader who has the voice in the final voice in a crisis. That's for him, the crisis is what settles who is in authority, and we English always had the opposite view. In a crisis, that's when you should look for the authority that has come about in peacetime. It's not the crisis that settles who is in authority, but the normal, peaceful dealings between people when there is no crisis. And the whole purpose of politics is to avoid crises. And on the whole, we English do avoid them very well. That's why we seem so complacent. And I think, I think that's the same as true here. That if you look back at people like Kelsen and so on, the Austro-Hungarian tradition, although it's very different from the English, it is talking about the normal way of dealing with things and not the crisis. As I understand it, the Enlightenment conception of, well, there's no one Enlightenment conception, but the Enlightenment conception that the American Constitution embodies tries to set the state up as the thing which settles disputes. The thing which maintains the ongoing peaceable communion of people and represents their interests in the world as a whole, which means it doesn't in itself dictate to them all the axioms which they will need for day-to-day living. There is also a whole sphere of human life in which morality and religion play their part, but those spheres are not in themselves the sphere of the political. So there's a separation of the political sphere from the moral, and certainly from the religious. That's obviously famously so in the American case. It doesn't mean that the state doesn't in some oblique way depend on those spheres, that if people become completely demoralized and completely lose all religious sense, then of course it could be that the state also suffers from that it's no longer able really to rely upon customs that it needed to rely upon in order to function. And I think that might be true. Humour is very important, and also satire of the opponent, you know. And it's very difficult because, as I was saying earlier, moral relativism has a tendency quickly to become a kind of absolutism of its own, you know. So that if you're making judgments, or if you're revealing that you have some source of values which you regard as sacred or holy or outside this, you know, just personal choice, then people do start abusing you, and that's undeniably true. But in the long run, you know, you can stand up to that, and things change. People might abuse you as a fascist or whatever for 10 years, but you know, when the results of their worldview are being felt all around them, they might come back to saying, you know, she was right all along. You know, and that's. I mean, to a very small extent, I've had this experience. I was when I started coming out as a conservative around about 1980. It was to the immense shock of the academic establishment, and there were lots of. I had to sue people to, you know, for libel for things that were said. There was a BBC programme with the sound of marching jackboots behind, you know, somebody commenting on something I'd written. Everything was done to make it look as though this was the thin end of the fascist wedge. And for a long time I was very disheartened by it, you know, and you can feel very, very distressed. But things have changed now, and you know, a great many people think that possibly I wasn't just totally wrong about everything. And a certain rehabilitation comes about. You know, I was sort of kept out of the British Academy, for instance, by all the old left establishment, Volheim and Williams and Isaiah Berlin and all that crowd. And then, you know, they all died. I have to say, I was out of the country at the time, had nothing to do with it, they just died. And the next week I was made a fellow of the British Academy, you know. So that was a sure sign that perhaps things do change. That certainly is true. Obviously, I mean, we all have plenty of examples, like just basic human relations. Families are differently constituted, and yet can live side by side, although. You know, still there might be a question of whether you have to be tolerant in order for this to happen. And toleration means perhaps accepting that it isn't that your neighbour isn't living in the right way, but nevertheless it's not for you. You have no right to interfere, and that's the very normal position to take, I suspect, in Western societies. And we don't go through life thinking that every question is to be settled by a moral absolute. I mean, we are negotiating creatures, and that's especially true of us Europeans, because our systems of law emerge from negotiation. They're not dictated from on high by God, unlike the Sharia. They are the results of discussions over many hundreds of years, even in the English case, 1,000 years. So we're used to the idea that that we don't settle all our questions by moral absolutes, but still we might need some of those absolutes in order to begin.
Yeah. It seems to me that maybe the worst outcome for a society that completely embraces moral relativism is just a reassertion of the idea that might is right, and sort of power politics. Do you agree with that, or is there a worse outcome?
There is. This is a quite interesting point. In the 1960s, when I wouldn't say the fall of man began then, but nevertheless, things did change, right, in a radical way. Very popular at the time was not just the relativistic morality of the student revolution, but the philosophy that rewrote morality as a system of power. Right. And this is obviously Foucault was the most important person in this, and the basic argument in Foucault's writings, and it's an argument which comes ultimately from Marx, is that moral judgments have no intrinsic validity. They are a part of ideology, whose reality has to be understood in terms of the power relations that they vindicate or endorse. To know what is being said by a moral judgment, you must go behind it, to discover the relations of power which are being concealed by it, right, and made to look legitimate. Once you think like that, you think that you have an absolute right to overthrow those relations of power, because they have no ground other than themselves, and with them overthrow the morality that goes with them. In Foucault's 4-volume Histoire de la Sexualité, which I'm sure some of you know, you discover what this all at work, this overthrowing of every possible system of sexual morality as a mere legitimization of power relations, which in particular historical contexts. And that's been very influential, of course, on on the sexual behavior of half-educated adolescents. Not fully educated or completely uneducated, but the ones in between. Foucault, of course, is a very important thinker in that he's sort of made the postmodern world through this kind of way of thinking. Well, I understand the problem, because obviously it's being talked about everywhere, and in particular the Hungarian situation. My view is that one should not look for political solutions to the problem that we've been discussing today. We're talking about something that goes to the heart of personal life and personal relations. It's as though the Enlightenment has finally come home to us, and what it means to us, and we many people feel, you know, that there's an urgent need, a worldwide need, to find some other foundation for the moral life than religion. Now, I'm skeptical that there really can be that other foundation, but certainly it can't be politics. One of the problems with communism is that it did try to provide an alternative foundation, not just for political order, but for the moral life, and to recruit everybody to a kind of militarized equality, which people have rejected because they've seen that it disenchanted human society completely, left people demoralized and in opposition to each other about everything. Harmony can come about, however, not through politics. It can only come about because people recognize the value of their own life and the value of the life of those around them, and that's something that has to be created through their own efforts.
Right. In America, a book called The Closing of the American Mind, the author talks about some of the effects of what you had mentioned, the pessimism and the skepticism, the dismissal of truth claims that came out of the 1960s. And he talks about it in the context of the university, such that students don't inquire after knowledge or seek after truth anymore. And he made a rather outrageous statement that he saw that as being somehow a worse situation than even the maybe religious wars that were happening
Yes.
in Europe. Do you think that's a little far-fetched, or is he trying to get at something that you know, possibly embracing that sort of moral relativism and it eroding the foundations of justice or as laws we talked about previously in the case of Britain? It has somehow a deadly effect on civilization in the long run.
Yes. Well, there is a tendency of people in universities to think that what's going on in the university is what really matters, and that was the case with Bloom when he was talking about the closing of the American mind. He really meant the fact that he couldn't talk to his students anymore. Mm-hmm. And outside the universities, there are all kinds of natural, normal Americans still existing, going about their business, going to church services. You know, America has remained a devout Christian society through all these things, at least if you're outside the cities. Right. And also, if you're outside the universities, a basically decent society. So the fact is that it wasn't as bad as he thought. Right. It was just bad for him. Yeah. But he had a point, because what he was saying was that the relativism had made it impossible for him to teach the curriculum as though it had any objective authority. That was really what upset him. You know, you couldn't say to the student, look, here is Shakespeare, and just look, and here is Steinbeck, you know, just look. Surely you've got to see that first thing is not just better, but touching on the human reality in a deeper way. And the students would say, that's your view, you know, I've got my Bob Dylan, and which is, you know, a million times better than what they have now. You know, there is a problem if you can't teach the old curriculum in the humanities because of this relativism. What are you going to teach students? Right. And increasingly, people teach pseudosciences instead. You know, the deconstructionist analysis of Steinbeck, or instead of teaching aesthetics, neuroaesthetics. You know, not knowing quite what that is. You know, it's Beethoven plus brain scans.
Well, is, after all, moral relativism that big of a problem? If it only amounts to maybe differences of opinions and occasional renegotiating of the political structure, is it really that big of a problem?
I would say that that we have to be much more careful of our institutions than moral relativists tend to be. Our values as Europeans come about through long-standing institutions. Here, as the gentleman said at the back, communism destroyed the institutional superstructure, but it needs to be rebuilt. The example of Bloom and the closing of the American mind, I think, is significant because it has become difficult to maintain the dignity of the university in the times in which we live. Churches find it extremely difficult to maintain their teaching when anything goes, traditional marriage, upon which the reproduction of society depends, as we all know, is under threat throughout the Western world as some supposedly arbitrary agreement between two adults to share each other's, or Kant said, a contract for the mutual use of the sexual organs. Kant's view, Kant was obviously quite repelled by marriage, as you can imagine, but that's the view that is prevailing, and of course it leaves children out of consideration. Once you've left children out of consideration, things have come to an end.
Right.
They haven't yet, though. I've got two.
Don't leave us on quite such a pessimistic note, so there is hope.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and please join me in thanking Roger Scruton.